This is a folding knife. They come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. And this is a sword. They too also come in a range of different shapes and sizes. But I haven't seen a folding knife as big as a sword. So today, that's what we're going to do. So to start with, I went and got this steel rod. I drew out the shape of my knife and I began to cut. You see, in preparation for this, I watched a lot of videos of people making folding knives, just little ones. And one thing they all did is they used a sanding belt and pushed the metal into it to get the correct shape they wanted. I don't have a bench sanding belt, I just have this sanding belt. But the sanding belt wasn't working all that well. I think it was made for wood, so I went and got my grinder to see if it would make a difference, and wow, the grinder was way faster. So for the rest of the build, I'm going to stick with the grinder.
After grinding out the rough shape of the blade, it was time to drill in a hole. This hole is going to be the hole that attaches it to the handle later on.
Now since I finished with the blade, I'm going to move on to the rest. Well, I'm not finished yet, I still have to sharpen it, but I'm going to do that last because I don't want to accidentally cut myself while I'm making the rest of the knife. The next part we're moving on to is the most important part. It's the lock mechanism. There are many different types of locking mechanisms we could use. This one is just very basic. It's using tension. It will be super tight, pressing against the blade, holding it in place, either open or close. It's very important that we get this part right because it's the most important part and the knife won't work without it. Oh, and I also made this little piece at the end to make it round and look nice, and also it actually affected the lock mechanism in a good way, so good thing I made it. And that's all we needed to do for the inside of the sword. Now it's time to make the handle, which was probably the hardest part. I thought it was going to be the lock. I was very wrong. I started off by getting this plank of jarrah. Surprisingly, it was very cheap. I had to cut it up into 3 small pieces, but I'm only going to be using 2. Once again, because I don't have a belt sander on the table, I'm just going to be using my grinder. Here I could have used that belt sander from earlier, the handheld one, but the grinder was just so much faster, so I just stuck with the grinder. But the handle can't just be wood. You see, I'm going to need something to act as a washer in between the wood and in between the knife. So to do that, I went and got these thin sheets of metal, which funny enough was the same metal I used when I was making my suit of armor.
And here are all the parts of the knife. Although they're not complete, at least I don't have to make any more pieces, I just have to refine them.
Now since the rough shape of the handle was done, it was time to drill holes in it so I could put it all together. I had to be very careful with this because all the holes had to line up perfectly. If they didn't, I'd have odd holes here and there and it just wouldn't look good. So I took extra care, measured twice and cut once. At this stage, the handle was too thick because the planks of wood were planks of wood. They're way too big to be a handle. So to cut away the wood, unfortunately, I had to waste a lot of it because I had to use my grinder and just sand away all of the wood. Okay, so it turns out my drilling wasn't so accurate. Unfortunately, I had to re-drill one of the holes. Also, I had to re-drill the hole on the blade because it was too small. After doing that, I also drilled a hole through the handle so I could attach the blade. So far, the build hadn't had any issues, and I was really happy about that. But unfortunately, I ran into my first problem, and that was the blade was not locking. It was way too loose, and it was just flopping around. I had 3 solutions. Solution number 1, drill another hole. If I add another hole in the middle, hopefully that will make it stronger. Although it could make it stronger, it also can make the lock mechanism weaker and more brittle over time. And well, it somewhat worked.
Although it worked, I still wasn't happy with it, so I went back to think of a new idea.
Solution number 2, that is to add pins. I was going to add these little pins that drop down to lock it in place. In order to do that, I had to drill a small hole in both the blade and in the handle. I accidentally snapped one of my drill bits doing this, but eventually I got the holes done. Now to make the pins, I'm going to be using a nail.
Since I already cut the hole the same width as the nail, all I have to do is cut up the nail and these will be our pins. They're small and all I have to do is not lose them. And I already failed.
And that didn't work at all. 3 things would happen. 1, the pins were too small, they would go in and there'd be no effect. 2, the pins were too big and I couldn't shut the handle. Or 3, it was the perfect size and when they went in and locked the blade in place, I couldn't unlock it. So I'm going to have to go back to the drawing board. Solution number 3, which should have been solution number 1, was to just recut the very end of the blade. I just had to cut it, make it more square, and that seemed to work. Okay, now since everything is almost done, it's time to shape the handle. It's time to get the handle down to a nice easy shape, easy to hold and fitting in my hand. To do this, I put the sword together and then started sanding it away, once again using the grinder. Can I just say, that grinder is the best thing I've ever bought. This is where we run into problem number 2 and 3 actually. Problem number 2 was all the nuts came off the bolts while I was sanding and they went flying. So that was very fun to find out. Anyway, I spent ages looking for them and I managed to find 3 of them. I almost gave up looking when I luckily found one more, but I was still one short. Luckily, I had 1 spare, so I couldn't let this happen again. Earlier I said ran into problems 2 and 3. Well, problem number 3 was I realized it wasn't sanding very well.
At first I thought it was because I was sanding too much, so I just tried the wood.
That's when I noticed I had completely destroyed the sanding disc. I quickly switched it over with a new one and got this shape. Almost done, I just had to round off the corners. After doing that, it fit in my hand perfectly and it was time to cut the metal again. I lined up the metal, drew the shape, and went back to cutting.
I did this to both sides. It was still a little sharp, but that's okay, we'll solve that in a second.
After cutting the metal out, I sandwiched it between the 2 bits of wood and went back to sanding just to get that perfect shape and to make it seamless. I wanted to make the whole handle smooth, and that included getting rid of these nuts and bolts. To do this, I went and got a drill piece that was roughly the same size as the bolts and drilled a hole. To make sure I got the right size, I did it on a scrap bit of wood first. It took me a few attempts, but eventually I found one the correct size before moving on to the handle itself. I had to make sure I drilled it deep enough that the bolts would be hidden, but not too deep that the bolts went all the way through the wood.
And now here's a rough look of how the sword's going to look when it's done.
Now it's time to move on to the part I've been looking forward to the most, and that's sharpening the blade. I thought this would be nice and fun and easy, but I actually realized I have no idea how to do this. So I went and got my grinder and started sanding it away. It was a bit awkward, and eventually I found out a good way to do it. I got it sharp. It wasn't razor sharp, but it definitely cuts. I'll show you later. There's still one thing that I wish I could have done to it, and that's heat treat it. Unfortunately, because I'm just in my backyard working with what I have, I don't have the correct equipment to heat treat it. Also, I don't know how to heat treat something. Heat treating is where you heat up the metal really hot and then dip it in an oil to make it stronger. It'll make the knife last longer and it'll make the blade just really strong. There's just one thing to do before we can call it good, and that's get rid of these bolts. Before showing you the sword, it would be awesome if you guys could like and subscribe. I'm trying to hit 1,000 subscribers and I can't do it without you. I love making these videos and I've got many more planned. So I hope you like the content. Alright, now it's time to see the sword.
And here it is. I didn't expect it to be this big or this cool looking. It looks just like an actual folding knife and I think it turns out perfect. If you guys have any more ideas of other things I should make, leave it in the comments below. I read every one.
Just opening the sword and I accidentally ripped my brand new shirt. So that's awesome. Great. Alright, so we're going to test the sharpness of the sword. Now, originally, I was just going to set up a pool noodle and cut that, because apparently that's what all other YouTubers do that use swords. They're pretty much like tatami mats, but tatami mats are really expensive. But it didn't go to plan. See, this happened. Now, I originally was going to compare it with the other swords as well. But considering I couldn't even set it up right, I'm just going to hold the pool noodle and then cut it. And this is how it went.
It cut through the pool noodle with zero resistance, or very close to little, but it wouldn't be a fair test unless I got another sword and did the same thing. Now, because I couldn't set up the pool noodle, there's only one sword I could test, and that's a gladiator. That's this thing. This is a surprise to no one, but the gladiator cut way better. I mean, it was made properly by somebody who knows what they're doing, so that makes sense.
So it cuts well, not as well as something that's manufactured properly. I mean, I could have told you that before actually cutting with it. Hope you guys like the video. I've got some cool ideas planned next, so stick around to watch those. Thanks for watching.